Are you ready? Got to put your seatbelt on. This is going to be fun. So it is actually my great honor to introduce you to a remarkable individual. His work spans the vast and sort of interconnected domains of psychiatry, neuroscience, philosophy, and literary scholarship. It's Dr. Iain McGilchrist, who now resides in the enchanting Isle of Skye off the coast of northwest Scotland. So he's coming from quite a distance. He's a prolific writer, and he is a sought-after lecturer worldwide. Dr. McGilchrist is passionately committed to the profound idea that the mind and brain can only be fully understood when viewed within the broadest possible context, encompassing both the physical and spiritual existence and wider human culture from which they emerge. And it's this culture, in turn, that both shapes and is shaped by our minds and brains. His most notable works include The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, a fantastic book. I recommend it. And his latest publication is known as sort of a monumental 2-volume work called The Matter of Things. The Matter with Things. It was released in November 2021. And it addresses profound questions like, who are we? What is the world? What is the nature of time and space? What do we mean by purpose, value, and the divine? And how do we set out finding the answers to those questions? So he's a deep thinker and a prolific writer. So you are in for a real treat. He is both a true scholar and a wonderful human being. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Iain McGilchrist.
Oh, thank you very much, Laura. And thank both of you for inviting me to address this conference. I suppose the first thing I have to say is that I'm going to talk about hemisphere differences, and you may think that you have heard that all of this is complete nonsense and that it was blown out of the water about 40 years ago. So there can't be any kind of science in it. I assure you there's a lot of science in it. What happened was that particularly after the split brain operations pioneered in California in the 50s and 60s, people were able to examine each hemisphere separately, and they came to some provisional conclusions, which is the way science works. It has some provisional ideas which are surely going to be wrong and then be supplanted by something more sophisticated. So the fact that we got the answers wrong, saying that the left hemisphere is purely rational and linguistic and the right hemisphere is a bit airy-fairy and given to painting pictures, it couldn't really be further from the truth. The right hemisphere is not at all unemotional and dependable. It is, in fact, left to its own devices, frankly delusional. And I'm not using that word in a kind of offhand kind of way. I'm a psychiatrist, and it literally becomes deluded. I'm not the only person who thinks this. I can cite at least a couple of other neurologists who have published independently exactly that insight. So what are these differences, and why should the brain be divided? Isn't this a bit of a puzzle? After all, the brain's power comes from making connections. Why would you have a whopping great divide down the middle? And why is the brain asymmetrical? It is. It's broader on the right towards the front, and it's broader on the left towards the back. And thirdly, there is a band of fibers at the base of the brain that connects these two hemispheres. It's called the corpus callosum. Only 2% of neurons actually cross it, and most of the traffic involves inhibition. So the ultimate function of communication is often to tell the other hemisphere to keep out of it. I'm dealing with this. Now, I think we all recognize that there's something wrong with the way we live. That's why I wrote a book called The Matter with Things. It's a pun on several levels, because I think it's partly to do with the fact that we don't understand the nature of matter and overvalue an idea of it as something very simple and basic, and that we think the world is made up of things. I argue, in fact, that relationships are what it is made of, that relationships come before relata, the things that are related. So knowing a little bit about the way our brains work may help us to understand some of the rather puzzling aspects of the way our minds work that have been noted over the centuries without any knowledge of the brain by many great philosophers. Indeed, Pascal in the 17th century said, so distinct are the two ways in which we approach the world that some people have thought that we have two souls. But the words to that same effect have been uttered by many, many philosophers. What are these two worlds then? They depend on an evolutionarily important distinction between the ways in which the two hemispheres approach the world. And this is to do with attention. Attention is the way in which we dispose our consciousness towards the world, with what values, with what aims, and in what quality of attention that we pay. Now, that is not disputed anywhere in neuroscience. Also in philosophy, people will readily accept that the way you attend changes what you find. And so if you put these two things together, you will see that these two hemispheres subtend, support, bring into reality for us two versions of the world. We're not aware of this most of the time because it's going on unconsciously and the choices are not made consciously. But we can harden up our thinking so that we pay more attention to one hemisphere than the other over the long run. What is the consequence of these different kinds of attention? Let me explain. Every creature has to learn how to do two apparently contradictory things at the same time. One is to grab food and to grab and manipulate anything that's of use, like a stick, a twig to build a nest, or a stick to use as a tool. And for this, you need a very finely tuned, detailed attention, sort of focused narrowly on something that occupies possibly only 3 out of the 360 degrees where one's attention could be directed. And that's fine, except that if that's the only kind of attention you pay, you'll soon become somebody else's lunch while you're trying to get your own, because you need at this very same time to be paying an entirely different kind of attention. The exact opposite, not committed to what it's going to find. I need one of those, I'm going to get it. I see one, I'll grab it. But to be open for whatever there is, including predators who are looking for you for their lunch, and including your kin, including your mate, your offspring, and your other conspecifics. In other words, to understand the whole picture. And if you want a very small, quick soundbite to express this difference, I sometimes say that the left hemisphere helps us apprehend the world, in other words, grapple onto it and grasp it and get it. It's the one, after all, that controls our right hand, which for most of us is the one with which we do the grasping and manipulating. And the right hemisphere helps us to comprehend, in other words, to gather together all the information that makes up the big picture. Now, clearly we need each of these. Without each of them, we wouldn't survive. But we can become, if you like, blind to the promptings of, and it usually is, of the right hemisphere. Why is this important? Because the way in which we think changes the way we live. And the way we live changes who we are, what society is, how we treat the natural world out of which we come and to which we will return, how we understand the larger cosmos in which we belong. The trouble is that over the course of Western history, we have had times when the two hemispheres have worked very well together. I would say probably the 6th century BC in Athens, around the year dot in the history of Rome, and again in the Renaissance in Europe. And that since the beginnings, where everything seemed to work rather harmoniously, there has become a tendency to overvalue and to be locked into the very narrow kind of attention that sees the world in a certain way. First of all, sees it as an object simply for use, lumps of stuff for us to grab, get, keep, mold, and make us powerful. And these two worlds have different qualities. So what are the qualities of the left hemisphere world? Well, it sees tiny bits, so it sees fragments. It sees those fragments as isolated, as broken away from their context, as largely abstract, not embedded in a body, a life, with all its feelings, moral compass, and perhaps spiritual awareness. It sees simply a thing that can be used, taken, and put together with other things to make something. Those things are static and they're essentially very explicit, and it can be easily articulated in language, in other words, and they are focused on with an intensity. And this world is not a living world. It is actually like a representation of the world. In fact, that's literally what happens. So any new experience is first appreciated by the right hemisphere, and almost immediately, so quickly that we're hardly as aware of it, taken up by the left hemisphere, which sees it as an example of X. So you see an absolutely staggering and awesome landscape, and your right hemisphere, if allowed, will bring this into being or allow it to emerge into being for you. But your left hemisphere almost immediately says, oh, got it. Picturesque landscape, one of those. Okay, next. Now, the difficulty with this is that we end up living in a very disembodied, disconnected, unempathic, effectively dead kind of a world. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere is seeing that nothing is ever certain. It's not random, but it's not ever actually fully 100% certain. The clarity depends on what you mean and what you are looking at. It's not a given that everything can be made clear. I believe that we should strive to be as clear as we possibly can, but not a whit more. When you try to push clarity on certain things, like love, like the nature of art, like poetry, like music, ritual, myth, the divine. In all these cases, the urge to make it clear and compatible with other things in a box makes you look at something else. You're not really seeing what it is at all. And then you perhaps decide, well, I don't think it really has any meaning or any importance. So this world of the right hemisphere sees all that is implicit, and almost everything that we value is, in fact, implicit. All those things that I mentioned must, in a way, remain implicit. If they're made explicit, they come crashing down, as if you were to paraphrase a great poem. It says, it's painful when somebody you love dies. Well, that's not really a great insight, but the actual poem may be so staggering that it changes the way you feel and think ever thereafter. So you've got a complex, rich, beautiful, manifold, forever flowing web of connections, which is highly animate in the right hemisphere, and a bunch of stuff that is inanimate and static in the left. When you come to think about the ways in which we try to understand the world, I would say there are probably four main paths by which we do it: reason, science, intuition, and imagination. And most people will accept science and reason, whoever they are, unless they're completely doctrinally against either of these rather valuable tools. But we've been taught to mistrust imagination and equate it with fantasy. It's nothing like fantasy. Fantasy takes you away from the real world. Imagination is the only chance we have to get into the real world and understand it for the first time. Intuition also is deeply important and much subtler than we are led to believe. So in intuition, we may be able to bring together at the same moment 10 or 12 strands of information, of thinking, and balance them quite unconsciously. Whereas if we're made to be entirely explicit and do it stepwise, we can only focus on one thing at a time. So this brings into reality, or brings into clarity perhaps, a distinction that is very important between the right and left hemispheres. The left hemisphere wants it's got to be this or it's got to be that, cut and dried, either or, black and white. Whereas the right hemisphere is able to see, well, hang on, it may be more like this. In fact, Ramachandran, you probably have heard of V.S. Ramachandran, a famous neuroscientist, calls the right hemisphere the devil's advocate for this very reason. And all of this is really on the left hemisphere side in the service of the lust for power and control. It's that it evolved for, after all. So you can't expect it really to take into account other values like courage and magnanimity, generosity, fidelity, or to see the great worth, perhaps the ultimate worth, of the good, the true, and the beautiful. It's just too busy grabbing stuff and putting it in its box. Now, in the modern world, I see just so many ways in which we are in a kind of trance, bewitched by the power, the influence that the left hemisphere, we believe, can give us. Unfortunately, the power that it gives us is only useful if it is matched by comparable wisdom. And wisdom doesn't come from the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is in every way more intelligent, more insightful, more perceptive, more attentive and more creative than the left. So while we need the left hemisphere, it becomes an absolute disaster if it calls the shots. It needs to be, in the title of my earlier book, The Master and His Emissary, it needs to be that emissary. It must not think it is the master. It knows so little that it thinks it knows everything. There's something that you've probably heard of called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which says just that the less you know, the more you think you know. And the more you know, the more you're aware of how little you actually do know. There's a sort of hubris, in other words, an arrogance that we can do anything, and we must and should be doing those things. A lot of this drive is against nature. I think that's one of the defining elements of our age, an all-out attack on everything in the natural world. Because nature is an affront to our belief that we are powerful. And it points out that we will fall ill, that we will die, that we will suffer. And these are things that in this cloud cuckoo land of the optimistic, ever optimistic left hemisphere, we shouldn't have to experience. I say ever optimistic because it's in denial. Denial is a very fine thing, and it's very obvious after a right hemisphere stroke. When the left hemisphere is left to itself, it will deny that a paralyzed limb is paralyzed, but if pressed to be aware that it is actually not functioning properly, they will say, oh, that doesn't belong to me. Who does it belong to? It belongs to that patient over there, or it belongs to you, doctor. So it is always right. As far as this is concerned, it can do everything, it will control everything, and the future is bright and wonderful. The right hemisphere, being cleverer, far more perceptive and intelligent, sees that it may not always be so, and is therefore, as I pointed out earlier, the one that is on the lookout. It's the one that produces sustained, vigilant, open attention to the whole. And so in our world, everything is broken up. There is no sense of the whole anymore. Everything is partwise. Everything is algorithmic in the way that a machine can follow a series of steps. In fact, nothing that we humans do is best done in this fashion. And interestingly, science hardly ever makes its big breakthroughs by following the so-called scientific method. In fact, most of the great insights in science and mathematics were made by the seeing of a new gestalt, that's to say, a new whole, a shift in the whole way in which the thing looks, like a picture that was out of focus, suddenly coming into focus, not by a series of steps, but suddenly being seen. And that causes an aha moment, as we call it. And that aha moment is robustly associated with activity in the right superior temporal sulcus and gyrus and the right amygdala. So almost all the things that really matter to us are the things that the right hemisphere would help us to see, though actually just to get stuff, which is a very necessary part of life, the left hemisphere is very valuable. But we have inverted the normal situation in which when I say the normal, I would say the correct, the true, the right relation, which is that the right hemisphere should have oversight and know when to call on the left hemisphere. In the myth of the master and his emissary, the left hemisphere is the brightest and best of the master's functionaries. And so he appoints this emissary to go about the world and do business on his behalf, business that he knows he must not get involved with if he's to keep the wise oversight of the whole society after which he looks. But this emissary is bright, but not by any means bright enough. It thinks it knows it all. And as a result, the emissary, the master, and the whole domain that had once flourished under the leadership of the master collapses. I believe we're approaching such a point in our history. We have been there before in the West at least twice. There are myths from all around the world that show an understanding of this two-mindedness, and the fact that one of them, the one that we should not trust, is the one that will repeatedly attempt a putsch, an overthrow, a rebellion against, a subjugation of the wise one that does know. You can find this, I have found it in staggering and sophisticated detail in a legend of the Onondaga people, part of the Iroquois nation. You can see it in the I Ching, you can see it in the Vedanta, you can see it in mythologies around the world. So we ought really to take this seriously and examine the ways in which we think, examine the values for which we work. There's an awful lot I could say, but I'm going to finish in a minute so that Derek and I can talk further. But I just want to say that there are three things that we know are profoundly important for human happiness and flourishing. And at the moment, you have probably heard correctly that there is an epidemic of mental illness. There has never been a time when people were so mentally disturbed as they now seem to be anywhere where our way of thinking, our modern technological minded way of thinking has penetrated. And those three things that are of paramount importance are belonging to a society where you trust people, you share values, you live your lives alongside them, you help one another, you worship together. And that is very important. It was noted some 50 years ago that there was a place in upstate New York, I think called Rosato, if I remember rightly, where people smoked more, drank more, and took less exercise than the average population, and yet had much higher rates of health, physical health, as well as happiness. And it turned out they were a largely homogeneous group of Italians who had emigrated there and who knew how to trust one another and shared values. In the modern world, of course, that is a difficult thing to bring about. Secondly, it is a closeness to nature. Until a couple of hundred years ago, 99.9% of all humanity would have lived inevitably in close contact with nature. But now perhaps only 50%, if that, do. And in contact with the natural world, not only do we feel spiritually renewed, but again, it improves cognition, lowers rates of stress and anger, and improves physical health as well as moral health. And the third is, and this is actually more important than either of the other two, the awareness of whatever you might like to call it, a higher power. It doesn't have to be named as God. In fact, names in this area are probably misleading, but I am referring to a divinity, something that is sacred, something that is the ground of being. If you have that in your life and you attend to it again, very important how you attend in this world, you become a happier and better person. And the effect is colossal, including once again on physical health. Now, to take these things up merely for physical health would be a typical left hemisphere motivation. Like, I want to be an even better stockbroker, so I'm going to meditate every day for 20 minutes. I'm told this will improve my acumen. I mean, that will probably happen. But the fact is, you're missing the point, because the point is a shift of heart and mind, a shift of values towards the things that really matter. And once you find that shift, see the world in a different way, things start to change. And it's that we need once again to embrace. Thank you.
Wow, that was great talking. I just love your work. I loved your book, and I think we could talk for hours and hours and hours, or days or weeks, about all the things that you covered in a very short time. So I'll take some questions from the audience, but I also have a few questions of my own that just based on sort of what you were talking about here, that I would love to follow up on. First, the idea of, in your book, you talk about the bird, but it's really all organisms sort of hunting for the food and also needing to not become food. And I think that is just this great analogy or metaphor, but also a real world situation of why the brain is in this hemispherical configuration. And it's really interesting that you tie that to to attention, because as you know, we have all these attentional disorders and things like that. I myself have ADHD, and I think much of my work in systems thinking has been because my attention is probably dominated by a little bit of both hemispheres. So I think you just make just such a remarkable point there. Talk a little bit about that the bird metaphor, and just so people really capture that, because to me that was like, when I read your book, I was like, wow, that just kind of hits it so beautifully.
Yes, well, as I say, all creatures have this structure. We can go back as far as 700 million years. There are creatures extant that have not really evolved over the last 700 million years and have networks that are the origin of the human brain, and they're already asymmetrical. They're already have distinct areas that work in balance with one another. Birds and almost all creatures, in fact, except mammals, don't even have a corpus callosum. So it is a remarkable business, this division. And the key is that it produces the ability, as I say, for the two types of attention not to interfere with one another. I mean, if you're wanting to make a hasty grab on a rabbit, the right hemisphere may well be saying, you could be making a mistake here. It might be something else. It's a much more thoughtful voice, really. But the left hemisphere can't be dealing with that. Obviously, it needs to go and either be right or wrong. But when it comes to planning, thinking deeply about what we're doing, looking at the directions of our life and so on, the right hemisphere really becomes exceedingly important. And the way in which attention changes the world, I could just give you an example that I sometimes use from the mountain that's behind my house. I live under the shadow of a great mountain on Skye, and its name in Norse, which has been adapted into English as Talisker, means the sloping rock. Now, what that tells us is that for Norsemen coming here 1,000 years ago, that rock told them that there was danger ahead because this is a bay in which you can easily be shipwrecked. That was what the mountain was for them, a landmark. We know that Picts lived in the shadow of it 1,000 years before that, and for them it was the home of the gods. In the 18th century, travelers came with their sketchbooks and painted it because it's a wonderful form of great texture and color richness. In the 19th century, people were very interested in geology, and it's an extraordinary example of basalt, a columnar basalt formation. To a speculator, therefore, it's dollars. To a physicist, it's 99.99% empty space, and the other 0.01%, we don't really know what it is. Now, which is the real mountain? The answer is none of them is the real mountain. There are all ways in which this mountain can come into being, depending on how we attend to it. That's terribly important. And just to say, well, really, it's just a lump of rock, is to make a very particular point of view, which is not necessarily going to guide you to rich information about it, but is the typical left hemisphere's approach. So how we attend both alters the world we're dealing with and alters us who are doing the attending. If you carry on attending in a certain way, you become this rather crabbed, perhaps even almost manipulative, psychopathic kind of person, bent only on power and control.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of a saying we say a lot, that when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change, and that is why such huge importance on the taking perspective and being able to take these multiple perspectives, and then the right hemisphere kind of combining all of them into a more holistic view that is capturing all of those different angles.
Yes, that's reminds me to make the point that the attitude of the two hemispheres towards everything differs, and the attitude to one another differs. So the right hemisphere realizes the importance of the left because it sees the whole, indeed appointed the emissary, if you like. But the left hemisphere doesn't see the importance of the right. And so people sometimes say, what would a right hemisphere world be like? And I would say very balanced, because it would know that it needed to keep the two in harmony. And these are the points in history when civilizations have really thrived. But they tend always to move more and more towards this rather sclerotic, hierarchical, unsubtle way of doing things, legislating over a large empire. And everything begins to suffer. The art begins to suffer. The wisdom suffers, the people suffer, eventually the empire collapses.
Very interesting. So and this is something that probably I certainly experienced, and other people might experience in your work, is sometimes it feels like you're being somewhat uncharitable to the left hemisphere, but you're essentially saying that if we were right in a society like the Renaissance or Athens, where we were more right hemisphere dominant or influenced, that the right kind of takes the left as very valuable, and so it wouldn't be unbalanced. Is that your sort of takeaway from it all?
That's exactly right. And I should just warn people that it's not that somehow the left is the sciences, and the right is the humanities. I mean, there's some truth in that, but both hemispheres need to be involved in everything that we do, just in different ways with different roles. And so what usually happens, and this did happen at those key moments I mentioned, is that there are great leaps forward in everything, in astronomy, in speculations in physics, in drama, in music, in exploration of the world. All these things, architecture, they all become suddenly very fruitful because of this working together. And then over time, this stereotypical, blockish, mammoth-like left hemisphere vision takes over. A reflection of the greed, the need for more. And of course, the valuable thing is to know when to stop pushing in a certain direction. I think we need to stop pushing that direction now.
It's like letting the child run the house.
Yes. I sometimes say that modern technology is like putting nuclear weapons in the hands of children, because frankly we haven't got the wisdom to know how to deal with it.
Right. So I'm curious, I'd love to zoom in a little bit on your thoughts about, I'm fascinated by the corpus callosum, because like you said, it's 2% of the neurons. It's not a significant amount, but it's doing something inhibitory and incredibly significant. And maybe the reason for this kind of imbalance, but also is the solution to the imbalance, likely. And in our world of systems thinking, we tend to call these things RDSs, or we zoom in on the relationship and all the complexities that are going on in the relationship between the two things. So this corpus callosum is this incredibly important inhibiting relationship between these two hemispheres. Talk a little bit about just that guy there, and what it does and why it does it, maybe even the evolutionary reasons for it.
Yes, well, as I say, it evolved with mammals. Before that, there were just very, very slight, like a 50th or 100th of the size, a couple of very small commissures. But why it started in the first place was that the first mammals had to be pretty sharp to live in a world dominated by vast reptiles, dinosaurs. Right. And so they needed smarter brains. They needed to be able to bring a lot of information. They were ground-hugging, nocturnal animals, like little rodents or whatever.
Rodents and things,
and they needed to bring together information, including across the front line, so that they could see. Dinosaurs were very bad at this, but mammals had a very good vision of things that were moving around them. And that was originally why the corpus callosum got going, in order to make fast connections. And then it's a complicated story, which I won't go into now, but it's in the first chapter of my book. It gradually became more and more used to inhibit. So it started off as largely facilitatory, and it's ended up being largely inhibitory, because as the brain became more and more complex, it needed to keep certain things apart. I mean, I often make the analogy with a surgical team. A surgical team consists of at least two critical people, a surgeon and a scrub nurse.
Yeah.
And without either of these, the operation is probably not going to go ahead at all. Well, certainly not without the surgeon. But it isn't helpful if the scrub nurse muscles in and starts making the incision that the surgeon has planned. And so cooperation, they must cooperate, but it doesn't mean doing the same job as the other one. Mm-hmm. So everything I see has this shape of a dipole, two things that apparently are quite distinct, but work importantly together and indeed are necessary for one another. One of the mistakes we make, I believe now, is to think that when we've made a distinction, we've made a hard and fast division, whereas often it's very important to see a distinction. It's like a bar magnet. You know, there is a North Pole and a South Pole, very differently. But, you know, the fact that those are quite distinct doesn't mean that somehow if you cut it in half, you'll do better, because you'll just have two tiny magnets, and that, right. you haven't got rid of one of the poles. It's in the nature of the thing. So in the nature of everything is the need to both bring things together and keep them separate.
Yes.
I've learned a lot from Goethe, and he said the whole business of nature is dividing what is united and uniting what is divided. And in some ways, the brain is a perfect image of that.
Yes. Yeah. And the DSRP really focuses on that, is that we're making distinctions all the time, but then we take different perspectives and those distinctions become blurry. So rather than having these two poles, which we do have between, two numbers are distinctly different, but there's an infinite number of shades of gray in between those numbers. Yes. And so
absolutely,
the brain is able to break down those distinctions at the same time that it's able to build them and live by them in many ways.
Yes.
Really fascinating.
Yes, absolutely.
I also thought it was fascinating. You talked a little bit about our understanding of matter and the idea that we think in things. And another thing DSRP really focuses on is underneath those things. Yes, there are things in the world, and we can bump up against them. But underneath those things are really just relationships between relationships between relationships. Talk a little bit more about that and the hemispherical nature of things.
Well, there is an Indian legend of Indra's net. This was a net cast over the cosmos by the god Indra. And at every crossing point in the net, there is suspended a jewel, and in that jewel is reflected all the other jewels in the net. Now, this is a very good way of thinking about the web of life and the web of existence, in fact, is that all is relational, but there are moments and points that attract our attention, and we call those things. But if we look at those things carefully, we'll see that much else is reflected in them. And it's this almost hologram-like
Yes.
nature of reality that I think that tells us about. One important difference between the left and right hemisphere in this respect is that the left hemisphere, as I say, sees isolated things, whereas the right hemisphere sees a web of connections. It sees those things, but it also sees that they don't stop where you think they stop. They go on into the environment, into other things, and so forth. And this, of course, is ancient knowledge of the wisdom literatures of the world. So this is a very important distinction, I think. And what I feel about matter, but we mustn't go there or we will we'll really run out of time. But I believe that matter is a manifestation of consciousness. I mean, if you think about it, we certainly don't know matter except via consciousness. And nobody's ever actually seen matter. They've only seen aspects of their experience, their conscious experience, to which they attribute the term material. That's a material object.
Right.
But it may or may not be that we only have consciousness because of matter, but it's certain that we only have matter because of consciousness in this sense, because matter is our way of interpreting something in our experience. And what I think is, there's a lot more to say in support of that view than I can obviously give now, is that really it's like a phase of consciousness, that matter is like a phase in a certain sense that physicists and chemists talk about a phase, the phases of water. In one of them, it's translucent and flowing and sort of move freely. In another, it's absolutely solid and opaque and won't move unless given a mighty blow. And, you know, in another, it's in this room, it's in your room, in tons in the atmosphere. And without it, you wouldn't be able to exist. Now, which is the real water? They're all water. And you may say, well, ice doesn't look like the stuff that's in this room. True, and matter doesn't look like consciousness, but it is an aspect of consciousness, an aspect that provides two very interesting things. One is a degree of resistance, and the other is a degree of persistence. So what is material tends to last for longer, as it were, hangs around for longer than my thoughts do, as I've written down. And it also offers resistance, which is by no means negative. A lot of things we think of as negative actually are crucial. They are the things that help creativity.
Yeah, and we don't want to just keep putting these negative, positive labels on everything because it's a form of bias, really.
Well, also, you know, you might ask, negative or positive in which context?
Which
because
context?
Often,
from what perspective?
Yeah, and often if you push a certain point of view far enough, you've altered the context so greatly that what used to be actually quite a useful thing has now become something rather toxic. So we need to know that you know, it's all to do with seeing the two sides of things and seeing them as connected and seeing context at everything.
And I want to get to some of the audience questions, but I have one last question for you, and then we'll get to those. I loved your reference to the importance of the relationship to nature. I think that's something that's being lost. And my own background as a mountain guide for most of my life, I think I've learned most of what I've learned about systems thinking has been from nature directly, and then I just kind of polish that up with a PhD in science and things like that. But talk a little bit more about why it is so critically important for us to be in nature and learn from nature, and why is that?
Well, there are several ways of approaching it. One is that, after all, it is our home. It's not the environment, which is a terrible word, which suggests it's something that lies around us.
Right.
It is us. We are in nature, and nature is in us. We are an expression of nature. We came out of it, and we go back to it. But this also helps us see certain things about the way the world is. When we're surrounded by machines, we think in terms of the machine model. And nature is nothing like a machine. Nothing that is an organism is at all like a mechanism. You can apply mechanical thinking to tiny details in an organism, which is a complex system. But it is not a complicated machine. It is a complex system with ultimately a degree of unpredictability because of the ways in which the elements in it recombine, affect one another, feed back into themselves, and so forth. So being surrounded by nature teaches us that there's more than we know, that there's things that are here that have been here since millions of years and should be able to carry on for them. We just are here for a short second or two to appreciate them. I think it speaks of that something beyond that is holy. To me, that has always been my experience of nature. Being in nature, being surrounded by nature, speaks to me of something that is beautiful, complex, completely awe-inspiring. And you know, we've lost the sense of awe, except before our gigantic egos. We're now so impressed by ourselves,
Yes.
our puny intellects, that we've stopped realizing how incredible nature is. I mean,
It's
in a
unbelievable.
single-celled organism, there are 10,000 different interactions, chemical interactions going on every second, and they interact with one another. When a baby, a human, is gestating in the womb, 4,000 neurons are generated every second on average. 4,000 neurons every second. And you know how complex the brain is, and they're different kinds of neurons, and they go in different places, and they mediate different functions. We haven't the foggiest idea how all this is going on.
Right.
And yet we think, oh yeah, in a few years, we'll have got it all worked out. We'll have got it nailed, you know? That's what they
Yep.
thought in physics in about 1900, that they'd all have to shut up shop and go home because they'd solved all the problems.
We figured
And
it
then suddenly, whoops, oh dear.
We're very impressed with ourselves, but
We are, too easily.
all right, a couple questions from the audience. How can we notice moments when we are stuck in the left hemisphere and intentionally bring the right hemisphere perspective back into the moment? Like, you know, on a daily basis, how can we kind of implement this?
Yes, it's a very good question. I think it becomes easier if you make certain habits. And one of the habits is to question the assumptions that lie behind what you just decided is important. So I think that it's always worth turning even things that look, you know, are widely agreed to, say, but what if that's actually not the case? And this is a very fruitful way to work that I was taught at university for whatever I was looking at. Take the accepted view of this and try seeing the opposite side that's being concealed, because I believe there always is something that's being concealed. Now, if you become aware of that, it's much easier to see what it is you're missing. Another exercise is actually to think, so if I'm not completely happy and fulfilled in my life, what is there that's on offer in this world that I'm missing out on? And if your answer is money, unless you're a very, very poor person, I think you're getting it wrong. It's going to be things that we now no longer seem to inculcate an awareness of in children in our education, which is, you know, the extraordinary beauty and richness of things that we can, yes, strive to understand, but never fully are able to do so. I think if you find that your thinking is becoming too rigid or you're getting frustrated with the way things are going, think about, well, am I actually pushing in the right direction? It's not always true that things will go easily for you, but I have noticed in life that when I stop pushing the wrong way and think, okay, this seems to want me to go another way, I find, a discovery, a treasure that I hadn't really known I was missing and lacking.
That's a great answer. Another one, how would Iain relate his findings to Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and 2 thinking?
Yes. Well, people imagine that probably the left hemisphere is System 2, the more sort of thoughtful, and the right hemisphere is System 1. Wrong. Absolutely the opposite is true. So the left hemisphere is the one that's quick and dirty. The right hemisphere is the one that says, oh, hang on a minute, you may be missing something. What about this? The left hemisphere jumps to conclusions. It's constantly making up a story that fits something it knows. It finds it very hard to break away from what it already thinks it knows. Whereas the right hemisphere is much easier to guide towards something new because it's already got a little question mark in its mind against what we've decided has to be the case. And in the books, I give examples of experiments in which it's quite obvious that the left hemisphere thinks it's being clever and gets the wrong answer. The right hemisphere sees something which is the right answer, but is actually a little diffident about it. You know, well, I think this is probably the way it works. So, and I've Kahneman and I have agreed that he's, as it were, cutting the cake from, separating the top of the brain from the bottom, whereas I'm separating the left from the right. So we're cutting it in different orthogonal planes.
Right. Well, we're going to have to wrap up there. Iain, it was absolutely a pleasure to have you here today. I just love your work. I think there's a lot to be learned from your books and your work. And I just can't say enough about your work. I think it's fantastic. And people that know me know that I don't say that about many things. So, I encourage everybody to read Iain's books, and go to your website, which is say it again.
Channel McGilchrist.
ChannelMcGilchrist.com or something like that. And
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us, and really appreciate it.
Thank you, Derek. It's been a great pleasure, and I hope in a rather hurried way I managed to convey something.
In a very short time, you hit on some really important stuff that we could think about and chew on for a very long time. So great job.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
I'll leave now, I think. Yeah.
Yep.